Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June Veeam and CyberFortress webinar. I'm one of your hosts, Jonah May, and I'm joined by the always great to present with Jason Buffington for our topic today.
Hey, Jonah, thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure to meet with you. I think we have a report you guys published recently that we're going to be diving into today.
We did. So back in May, so at Veeam we published this year's version of the Ransomware Trends Report. So a couple things that happened. So one of the things that I do in my day job is I help lead all of our strategic independent research. So all the data that we're going to cover today actually is not Veeam customers. In fact, what Veeam does is we identify some personas or some scenarios that we'd like to get intelligence on. The independent research firms, they go out, they find organizations that fit those demographics and ask for that. And for this year's report, they found 1,200 organizations, all of whom had suffered at least one successful cyber attack in calendar 2022. So this is 1,200 folks that were responsible, that had some involvement in a cyber event. In fact, if you go to the next slide, you can see that one of the other design goals with this was that we had a certain percentage of CISOs, a percentage of backup admins, a percentage of IT operations, and a percentage of security professionals. So really all the roles that might be involved in either prevention or remediation of a cyber event. Also, we wanted to make sure the survey was representative of not just large enterprises or not just small and mid-sized, but really a healthy swath along the way. So this is some of the data. And again, I can't stress enough, not Veeam customers, hopefully not CyberFortress customers either, for that matter. This is an unbiased sampling for lessons learned. By the way, on average, the average organization got hit about 2.3 times. So this is not only surmising 1,200 IT professionals, it's also surmising almost 3,000 cyber events over the calendar 2022. So let's get into it.
All right. And I always appreciate reading these reports because they've always got a lot of good numbers and insights in them. It's always interesting to see the shifts from one year to the next when I look over them.
Yeah, and for the folks at home that are reading over these, and hopefully you'll get a chance to download the report as part of today's event. The main reason that Veeam does this, actually, other than helping us decide what to build, right? So understanding what are the actual problem statements that need to be solved for. But beyond that, it's really to equip folks like that are on today's call just to have better conversations. Right. So my guess is that hopefully most of the folks in the call today self-identify as one of the four personas listed on the chart today, an executive, a backup person, an IT operations person, or a security professional. You know, in many cases, we're surprised to find out how many folks don't know who all the other folks on that wheel are. And so hopefully this data gives you some opportunities to create some new conversations. And my guess is the nice folks at CyberFortress will even let your peers watch this webinar after the fact. But I could be wrong on that. But let's talk about some of those personas, because there is a little bit of a disconnect between the organizations.
Yeah, I do like seeing that, almost perfectly. It is a nice mix of all four personas. That way we're not too heavily weighted from someone who's maybe an executive or security minded, kind of like you were saying, it's a nice little mix of everyone between personas and organization size. So it's a very holistic look at things from what I can tell in reading it in previous years and in this year.
Yeah, the audience that we think was perhaps more focused on. So our goals actually, when we gave it to the research firm, was 2020, 2040, and give or take 1% on each. I thought they did a really good job with it. So, but let's start taking a look at some of the data, because this will actually start to that conversation. And we look at those four personas. I think one of the most interesting things is 60% of organizations actually said that they need either a significant improvement or a complete overhaul between the workings of the cyber team, let's call them the preparedness folks, and the backup team, so call those the remediation or the fix-it folks. And I think that's interesting because, in fact, when you, and there's lots of different cuts in this, you can download the report to find some of them. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting, perhaps for this audience of cyber fortressers, is that the proper noun for y'all? But one of the things was that when we cut this question by the four personas, it turns out the backup admin was the least satisfied with the interactions between backup and cyber of the four personas. And Jonah, I've been in this industry a long time, and it's surprising to me, even in 2023, how in so many cases, when you start to have this kind of a conversation, the four personas may not even know who each other are. They certainly are not collaborating at a material level.
I would agree with that. I see that quite a bit also, so from kind of both our sales side and even a little bit helping on the support side occasionally with some things like some of our offsite DR tests. It seems like more often than not, we really only talk to the IT admins overseeing the backups, or they're the ones performing the tests. Some of the better ones will maybe bring in some end users, but it's very rare that you see an executive come into any of those discussions with us, or even a security team for them to ask their questions, unless it's a environment that is extremely locked down. Like I'm talking maybe like a government office.
Yeah, in fact, in the same cut, not only were the backup admins the least satisfied, actually the IT executive was actually the persona that was perhaps most satisfied, and even they over 50% saw that same need for significant improvement or complete overhaul. In fact, that's actually a meta trend that we saw across most of the questions in the survey is that for some, and with no disrespect to any execs that are on the call for today, there is almost an overly optimistic naivety where things where the CISOs were like, yeah, we think things are going pretty well, or at least better than those folks that are in the trenches. So again, hopefully some of this data helps create some new conversations among the various roles within the various organizations.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to know with some of this, like something I seemingly encounter a lot is kind of in regards to siloing between the different teams. It's really hard to get that balance right. It always seems like there's always a little too much siloing and not enough communication between teams, or there's too little. And usually that translates to there being a lot of bleed over, like maybe your IT admin is your security person. There's not a dedicated person. So I'd kind of be curious of these people talking overhauls and improvements, kind of which side of that spectrum do they fall on?
Well, hopefully in a smaller organization where someone actually has all those roles, hopefully their right hand knows what their left hand is doing. It's really when you start to have separation of roles that becomes kind of a challenge. Now that's the bad news, right? So the bad news is that yes, there is a team collaboration gap, for lack of a better term. However, the other side of that is that most organizations today do understand that cyber is a disaster. And so holistically, we do see more and more there is a single strategy that is inclusive of not just traditional disasters like fire and flood and hurricane and tornado, but certainly ransomware as well, because you're always dealing with that kind of scale and a critical impetus in order to get things back up and going again. And I think because of that, you are seeing some of the same foundational building blocks in the strategy that you would typically find otherwise. So as an example, if we look on the next slide, you'll see that while there are many things that might vary, one of the things most consistent in most cyber strategies is the recognition that if you don't have a good backup, pretty much all the other stuff becomes nearly moot.
Yeah, well, and of course, how do you know you have a good backup? You test it. What's interesting to me with this is I'm kind of surprised, quite honestly, to see those two numbers at the bottom. Like, I want to touch on that for a minute. Only 2% said they didn't have an incident response team. Only 3% said they didn't have a ransomware playbook. I don't know, that doesn't, a lot of the data in these reports tend to align with what I see in the industry. Those two stand out though, as they don't. I mean, a lot of our customers, at least when they come in, they don't have those incident response teams. They don't have those ransomware playbooks, which is why in part over the years, I've helped CyberFortress, and CyberFortress has published documents on how to write and create some of that. You know, I know we go through a lot of the discussions when we're onboarding customers, but I don't know that anything ever formally gets written down or documented. So kind of in a subset of that, I'd be curious, like, oh, you have a ransomware book. Okay, is it written down? How often is it updated? Who has access to it? Or is it like a single document maybe your main IT admin has, or maybe it's some verbal agreement someone has come up with, and maybe those people aren't with the company anymore?
Yeah, so you bring up a good point that that for many organizations that can mean different things, right? So one thing that happens when you do quantitative research like this is you don't actually put in the definition of what does an incident response team look like, right? So that everyone can say, "Why, yes, I do have something that exactly meets that definition," or not. So there is some sentiment that kind of goes into this, but the bottom line is, and by the way, you're also astute in that you mentioned that for many organizations they don't have that. I will tell you that when this data was run just a year ago, both of those numbers were greater than 2x what they are now. So I do think that you are seeing a significant shift towards that. Now, is every response team perfect? No. But if you ask the person who's responsible for, say, backup, do they know the 6 people that are going to be the first ones to get on a call? Yes. Is it written down so that any of the other 5 know who the other 6 are? Perhaps not. But there is, in some cases, a working idea of these are the folks that are out there. Now, one of the things I'm always curious about, and in fact, I've watched this play out a few times when we do role play exercises around cyber, is often we talk about traditional disasters. And by the way, I'm an old school DR guy, so I have been in the disaster recovery traditional space for almost 34 years, and so. It used to be when you would do tabletops, one of the things that you assumed for was that the smartest person in the room is no longer in the room, right? So you assume that the person that probably has all the answers is also unavailable. Now, in some disasters, that is unfortunately due to loss of life. In other cases, like you and I are both in Texas. If you have a flood in downtown Houston, probably the IT leader's home is also flooded, and he ain't coming to work that day, right? So there's all kinds of reasons why your head SME might not be there. Now, one of the things I think is interesting about the incident response team is certainly if you're doing it right, there's a broad variety of personas like the 4 that we've been talking about in the room. Every one of them brings something unique to that picture. And so it'd be interesting to find out when you do those tabletop exercises, and here's your homework assignment, pick one of those folks who is not available for whatever reason. Hey, they're on a cruise. They're on bereavement. They just don't want to feel like it. Whatever it is, presume that one of them is not there. How does that change your playbook? And hopefully it forces you to say, okay, let's document what's in all the smart people's heads so that that plan works the same way with or without the human individual itself.
Yeah, and it is really interesting that you go into that because as I'm sure and our audience probably knows, we decided to call this webinar Be Prepared because you and I both have scouting backgrounds, and going through the program as a youth, as I got closer to my Eagle Scout and started working on that service project, something that was always drilled into me by my leaders was that project, or at least its final plan before I execute, should be so detailed that if I weren't able to make it because I was sick or I got hit by a car, someone could essentially take that binder with my plans and execute the entire project for me in my stead, which sounds extremely similar to what you're talking about here.
I am not an Eagle Scout, but I have mentored several over my years as an adult. And yes, I give that talk every time. Assume you got COVID, assume you got hit by a truck, assume something, you're not there. How does the plan work? And that is true for almost everything on here. Maybe one of the reasons why I like the data protection industry is because it does have the same motto as scouting, right? Be prepared. And one of those is be prepared to restore, right? And that's going to bring us from the bottom of the list. Make sure you have a plan, make sure you have documentation, to the top of the list, which is make sure you have a good backup. And good is not a subjective term. Good means, do you have survivable copies? Good means, have you confirmed they are restorable, right? Good is not subjective in this case. Good actually means, do I know? Be prepared to restore, because if we're talking about ransomware, you should plan on getting hit, right? In fact, 85% of organizations actually got hit at least once last year. Only 15% said they didn't. So you should plan. This is a when, not an if. You should plan on getting hit, and everything else we talk about is going to waterfall off of that. Now, if you think the 85% number is bad, let's go to the next one because it gets worse from there. We talk about when organizations were asked, so in the largest independent research project of its kind, so 4,200 organizations across 28 countries worldwide were asked, did you get hit? Only 15% said no. In fact, the average was 2.3 hits per year. Probably worst case, though, was the idea that more folks got hit 4 or more times, meaning quarterly cyber events, than said they didn't get hit at all. But when you think about frequency, that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happens when it happens, right? So let's take a look at this data. So organizations were asked on the left-hand side, what percentage of the production data do you believe the ransomware attack was able to successfully affect or encrypt? Right? And the average is 45%, but there's a few things in there that's worse than that. Take a look in the upper left-hand corner, and I know there's a lot of percentage signs on this chart, but if you take a look in the upper left-hand corner, 81 to 100% of the data. So I'm actually going to a scout camp tomorrow, in fact, and it's up in Missouri. We always drive through Joplin as part of that in the United States, and there are still parts of the decimation of a tornado actually in Joplin from when it got hit so many years ago. And it's amazing when you go and look at a tornado site and you go to where a house used to be, and what you have left is a concrete slab and a few wooden studs poking out of the ground. That's what 81 to 100% of your data being encrypted looks like. It is a slab and some studs of what was your IT infrastructure, right? And for 14% of organizations, 1 in 7, right? How do you feel lucky? In 1 in 7 organizations, their IT production data set was down to the slab and some studs. And even if you don't think you're in the dire case, 45%. Now, for the folks at home, 45% is a number, so let me make it a little bit more personal for you. I'm going to round down. I'm going to be an optimist, 40%, right? That's 2 out of 5 hard drives. That's 2 out of 5 mailboxes, 2 out of 5 applications. When we do all these scouting events and other kinds of family events, there's always pictures, right? So you want to make this personal for everyone who's here who is a parent. 2 out of 5 of your kids' pictures when they were little, right? If you're older, 2 out of 5 of your grandparents' pictures when they were little. You don't get to do those over again, right? 2 out of 5 of whatever you call precious has now been shredded. And that is the average. So hopefully that is the doom and gloom. Let me unpack the other half of that. And then, Jonah, let's talk about how crazy that gets. So 45% of your data on average is affected during a ransomware attack. On average, the respondents, and this again is where I'm obliged to say not Veeam customers, not CyberFortress customers, they were only able to, on average, get back about 2/3 of what was affected. So if 45% went through a shredder and you could get 2/3 of it back the napkin math, plan to lose 15% of your production data set, 1/6, right? All you got to do is just have 1/6 of extra data lying around that you don't care about, and you're going to be good. Most people do not have that luxury. Jonah, what are your thoughts?
Very accurate, if not a little generous, based on some of the customers I've dealt with that have come in maybe after a ransomware event, or they've spoken to me about ones they've had in previous years before they came on with us. What I'm kind of curious in that 66% recoverable metric, and maybe you have this information, I'm not sure, but in that kind of what's the breakdown of why wasn't the data recoverable? How much of it was because maybe they didn't have backups at all of the data versus, maybe they decided they're backing up, say, Joni in accounting's desktop, and, they're trying to get back terabytes of production data. And you know what? Maybe we don't need to restore her desktop. Everything she has that's important should be saved to a file server or to OneDrive. And maybe we just need to redeploy the Windows machine from scratch for her, or, similar logic, but maybe for tape. Maybe we're limited on our restore speeds. So we decide, hey, these servers aren't mission critical. Let's just rebuild them from scratch. But maybe we actually had the data for them. We just chose not to recover them.
So we actually do have that. And at the risk of you go download the report because it's in there. But for the kids at home, let's go ahead and answer that question. On average, 93% of the attacks that happened, actually, of the organizations that were attacked, some of the questions that were actually in the survey asked what kinds of platforms were targeted. You brought up Windows devices. Anytime that you have a large install base, it also makes for a large attack surface, especially if you don't maintain patches, right? But in 93% of cases, the backup repository was specifically targeted by the bad actor, right? And by the way, the backup repository was successfully affected in 75% of the cases, in 3 out of 4, right? Say that again. in 3 out of 4 cases, the backup repository was successfully encumbered during the cyber attack. And here's the way I look at it. Here's another scouting example for you. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going on a Sea Scout event, going down the Caribbean for about a week, living on a boat with a bunch of high schooler kids. Here's the trick. If somebody pushes me overboard off the boat in the middle of the ocean, right? And then they want to sell me a life preserver. They want to sell me the ability to save myself. Now, of course, that's not a very scout-like thing to do, so maybe this is a bad example. But when you think about what the cyber actor is doing, the cyber actor actually is a salesperson. They are selling you the potential to survive, right? Now, what's going to stop me from being willing to pay for that life preserver? Well, if I can swim back to shore or swim to the boat, meaning can I save myself, then I'm not going to pay for that life preserver. If there's something else floating in the ocean nearby, a little floatable or something, piece of driftwood, I don't care, that I can save myself and I won't pay the ransom. So in 93% or more of cases, the cyber actor's standard SOP is to get rid of the backup repositories so that you do not have the ability to save yourself, right? Because at that point, you have no choice other than to pay the ransom. They are in sales mode at that point. And so when we look at why is it that organizations were only able to recover X, if you run the math on it, it's not that far off that in 3 out of 4 cases, the backup repository was encumbered. And here we see only 66% of organizations said they were able to recover. I mean, they were only able to recover about 66% of the data. The numbers are only off by, what is that, 8 points? So I think there's a strong causality between if you don't got repositories no more, then you're going to pay the ransom, or you're just not going to have data anymore. And those are your 2 choices. So anyway, that's probably the least scout-like example I can come up with, but hopefully it works for the example for today. If I'm not here in July, it's because somebody pushed me overboard and I chose not to pay for the life preserver. You heard it here first.
Yeah. Well, building on that a little too, I'd be curious in this breakdown, how does small enterprise versus large enterprise correlate to the percentage recovered? Because
nearly flat.
like you were talking, okay, because you were saying about 75% of, cases, the backup repositories themselves are successfully penetrated. And I would definitely say that unfortunately aligns with a lot of what I see as we've brought customers in, not naming names or shaming people, we do this for a living, so we have a bit of a different mentality to it. But I see a lot of cases where maybe someone just, oh, let's join the Veeam server and the Veeam components, or the insert backup software here, and it's backups to the domain because that way it's easier. We can do, let our users restore things. And when you get ransomed, that really doesn't go that well. Or hey, we don't want to purchase some new hardware. Let's build it inside of a VM in our production data stores, and we are seeing, I think Veeam wrote up a very good article about it last year, where ESX now is being encrypted both at the hypervisor and data store level. And unfortunately, if you don't take those considerations into your architecture, you're in for a very not fun time when you get penetrated, because you're going to find pretty quickly, hey, my backups are gone. But I mean, I guess that's why we have 3-2-1, right? Theoretically, one's off-site.
The other thing though that so we did actually test some of those things, like does the strategy vary based on the size of the organization? Now, the rationale actually is different. Okay. So, for example, and the example I use for this anytime I look at any kind of disaster scenario is when you're talking to a large enterprise and they have several experts on staff. One of those IT folks is Clark Kent, right? And so when everything goes, I'm a comic nerd. I know that's atypical in the IT industry, but it's true. When a disaster actually strikes, Clark Kent goes into a closet. Superman comes out, and we can save the day, right? Small and mid-sized organizations don't got Clark Kent, right? They don't have Jimmy Olsen, right? They don't have that skill that can put on a cape and save the day. And so there is a difference in the mindset. It's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of managed services and as a service architecture, is because then, while small and mid-sized businesses can't afford a Clark Kent, CyberFortress can afford a Jonah May, which is effectively the same thing, right? So the idea of some kind of hero that can say, I do this for a living, let me come in and solve the problem for you. So you do see that in small and mid-sized organizations, there's a dependency of expertise because they can't maintain it in-house. With large enterprise, you actually have the same outcome, but for a different reason. It's not that they can't afford the expert on staff, but they'd rather that expert work on things that are material to creating value to the business. And so let's outsource traditional hero stuff, right? So they can do the, evil genius Mad Hatter kind of thing instead. But either way, so the rationale behind why they might absorb as a service or managed service actually varies based on the size of the org. They can't afford it, or they'd rather them do other high value things. Either way, they're both looking for Clark Kent. They're both presuming that's probably going to come more from managed service than necessarily from their own bench. And so you do see kind of that dynamic that comes out of that as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty close to what I see with it. I was actually going to say, I almost see a bit of a bell curve, at least when you're taking into mind with Veeam specifically, the architecture and the hardening of it, where smaller, medium-sized organizations, they don't necessarily have that, like you said, they don't have that Clark Kent on staff. They're not maybe taking those things into consideration. But as you start to trend really large on organizations, you almost kind of hit this size where there's so many moving parts and there's so many people that might be asking for restores or involved in the process, where you see maybe some compromises made, like, once again, maybe you join that backup server to your production domain versus that medium large organization where maybe they only have one or two of those Clark Kents really seem to be the ones that have their backup and their production environments really hardened and ratcheted up the most of everyone.
Yeah, I think the bell curve is a good example for that. In this case, it's almost an inverted bell curve, right? So we do see more of that consumption both on both ends of the curve, more than sometimes towards the middle. I think the other thing that that kind of comes out of that, and we can go to the next slide for this, is for many organizations, they might presume that the reason to pay or not pay is just because they don't think there's any other choice, that it's not a tenable example. And so so if you are in the mindset, by the way, interestingly enough, 80% of organizations actually do pay the ransom, right? The reason that ransomware is big business, and that's what it is. It's not typically violence, except unless it's state sponsored, but for most cases, it's big business. And the reason is because it's profitable. 80% of your customers do end up buying, or actually, I guess 80% of your prospects do end up actually buying your product, meaning the potential to survive. But there's a couple nuances in this that I think is worth pointing out. Take a look at the data on the left-hand side, right? So 80%, so that is the dark blue, 59%, so call it 3 out of 5, pay and are able to recover. In the light green, 21% pay but are not able to recover. And I think one thing that I think Hollywood actually does a disservice to us is, Hollywood, when the bad actors get in the computer system, and inevitably it's some teenager that says, I can do this on the keyboard for 20 seconds. And okay, we're up, go. Right. So that is, first of all, there's so many things wrong with that. I mean, not that the teenager probably isn't the most technical person in the room, but everything else after that is kind of a flawed model. But while encryption technologies tend to operate in parallel, decryption technologies tend to operate in serial. So there's never a wave your magic wand and poof, everything works. Unless you're talking about unhardening a BIOS, everything else is going to be serial and slow. But I promise you, the bad actors put a lot more effort in quality control for the encryptor than they do the decryptor. And so what you end up with is in 1 out of 4. In fact, if you're multitasking and you're doing emails or something else while you're doing this, just write this down on a Post-it note. 1 in 4 organizations that pay the ransom still couldn't recover. 1 in 4. In fact, more organizations, 21%, paid but could not recover than the 16% of organizations that did not pay but were able to restore themselves, right? And that juxtaposition is actually kind of a summary of what's wrong with ransomware in 2023. More people paid but couldn't recover than organizations that recovered without paying. Honestly, if I could wave my magic wand, the purpose of Veeam, and I'm going to guess the purpose of Cyber Fortress, is to be able to help the other 84%. If 16% said they could recover without paying, how do we collectively help the other 84% of cyber victims be able to answer that same way? No, I didn't pay. I recovered myself instead, because if that number gets larger and larger, then ransomware bad actors have less and less incentive to continue to do their evil deeds. Thoughts?
Those numbers seem pretty accurate. I see a lot of people that come on at both in my life here at Cyber Fortress and my life at previous companies that come in interested in Veeam because unfortunately they're using some backup software that maybe they implemented 5, 10, even sometimes 15 or more years ago. Because, back then that was the software to use, that was the way to set it up, and they never really tested restores. They never thought about it from how it would actually work if they had to recover back. And maybe they did have the data, but maybe it took them, maybe they had to pay the ransom because it was all on tape and it was going to take them 18 months to restore back because they were using backup exec or something along those lines. And unfortunately, there is a growing mentality that we're shifting more from a backup second mentality to a backup first mentality, where we're thinking about those things before the ransomware event. But it does seem like in a lot of cases, people moving over to Veeam and or Cyber Fortress come because they've been impacted by a ransomware event and their backup software wasn't up to snuff, whatever they were using at the time.
Well, speaking of up to snuff, looks like you've got a couple recommendations on that right-hand side.
Yeah, so new with version 11 and now Cloud Connect with version 12. We'll be supporting it in coming months. Continuous data protection, that's really nice because let's say I have a mission critical SQL database or file server where I need to have restored down to the minutes or seconds, Now with Veeam, we can of course protect that, though I will always advocate for multiple tiers of backup with Veeam. Never just do CDP or replication, always do backups, because we have seen, hey, maybe I'm a malicious actor and I infected you 3 months ago and I finally decided to encrypt you and it's a time bomb. CDP and replication aren't going to go that far back. But when they are usable, it's a very quick recovery. Just one click to bring it up, 1 or 2 clicks to bring it back when you're ready to bring it back on-prem for replication and backup. And even so, we as a service provider have developed processes and automations in which we can take your Cloud Connect backup workloads, and just like you'd be able to say instant recover those on premises, we can actually instant recover those into a sandbox for you here. So if you don't have replication, or your replication / CDP isn't good, or maybe you've mixed workloads based on what application tier your workloads are, we can bring back just about all of it for you into a sandbox, let you essentially run in our infrastructure until you're ready to restore back on-prem or to your colo or wherever your production environment may have been located. And of course, you have a team of experts / Clark Kents, like Jason said earlier. So you've got me, you've got our very knowledgeable support team. We have several Veeam certified engineers over there. And I myself, besides a Vanguard, am also a Veeam certified architect. So needless to say, we know Veeam like the back of our hands.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let's dig in a little bit more. If we take a look at the next piece. Now, this you talked about architecture point of view. I'd like to hear more about when you talk about it from an insider's viewpoint.
Right. So insiders. And it's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, insider protection, yeah, it's there in case maybe you get some disgruntled employee or contractor that goes and decides to delete everything on you. But really 98, 99% of the time, insider protection is more protection from compromise, like a ransomware attack. And it is mentioned on this slide, but the name is, well, I guess ransomware insider protection covers them both, but it's maybe someone who was social engineered and their account was penetrated and the actor got in through their account, logged into a VPN, like we've seen with a few companies over the last 6 months. And, maybe they started going in and bombing out the Slack channel. Maybe they started going in and deleting everything. Maybe they accessed the backup infrastructure and tried to delete it. The nice thing about insider protection is if that data gets deleted, it goes to a recycle bin on our side that essentially only we can see. As far as your malicious actor is concerned, those backups are deleted, but then we can go in and we can launch them for you, or we can put them back into a folder for you once you've spun up a new environment and guaranteed you're safe. And, we can start that recovery process. That way, no matter what happens, your backups don't get deleted.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how many organizations underestimate the impact of a compromised credential. So I like the idea of thinking about insider, meaning either the genuine insider, so a malicious employee that might be disgruntled, or a faux employee, meaning someone who has a compromised credential. And there's all kinds of best practices. You could talk to them even better than I can around why you want to have separate credentials between how you manage your backups versus how you manage the rest of the environment, why you want to have separate credentials for the backup repositories versus not. It's all about providing insulation so that you have survivable copies of your data, so that you can restore when everything else has gone bad. And that's actually going to bring me into our next data point, because not only did the survey look at some of the calamities at scale within the attacks themselves, it also looked at lessons learned. And so some of the questions in the survey actually looked at what are you doing now that you might not have been doing when the actual cyber events occurred. One of the most common trends actually was around the use of immutable repositories for the backups, because, as we said earlier, in 75% of cases, the bad actor was successful in encumbering repositories, which meant that it reduced the ability for them to save themselves, right? Our whole goal in life, let's go back, is to recover, to help more than just 16% say they didn't pay, they were restored instead. And what you're looking at here is organizations were able to choose more than one as far as kinds of immutable repositories that they now use, irregardless of what they might have been using during the time of the attack. And I do think there's some interesting trends here. I like the fact that the two most common types of immutable repositories are both cloudy. I like that because that also creates geo-separation as well as takes advantage of more modern technologies. And then you can see in the green, there's two different kinds of on-prem. There's traditional storage, which might be storage within a backup appliance or backup server itself, as well as, say, an object appliance that might be more purpose-built for backup as a repository type. I love the fact that tape still matters, right? So air gapping a tape, it is hard to be more air gapped than to take a tape out of a driver changer and stick it on a shelf, right? You don't even have to put it in a vault, right? Just literally physically take it where that it cannot be accessed by the heads. And guess what? You have a survivable copy of your data. And the older those are, the better the chances are that the malware does not extend back that far. But I like the fact that the top two really are cloudy. I think the fact there's only 7 points of difference between the two kinds of clouds, I think speaks volumes. We've got some new data coming out in a few months, really looking at how customers are choosing clouds, plural, as part of their data protection strategy. In fact, the numbers that you see on the right is if the 82% of organizations chose one or both clouds. Right. So this goes back to that belt and suspenders kind of style, or in the be prepared mantra, be prepared that even one of your survivable repositories might not be there anymore for whatever reason, probably because of compromised credentials. And so the fact that 4 out of 5 organizations use at least one cloud as an immutable tier, 2 out of 3, 64%, use at least one kind of on-premise disk, which has an immutable option, right? And then tape still matters. In fact, my favorite part of this is when you add up 82 and 64, that's about 146. Throw some tape back in there, you had 160%. And really, your goal ought to be 300%, right? Your goal ought to be that when it first goes to disk, it's a mutable disk. And then that's for your rapid recoveries, SLAs, 60 days, 90 days, whatever you're doing on-prem. And then when it goes, those DR copies and those ransomware copies and those cloud copies, that ought to be a immutable cloud. And for the small percentage of your data that has 10-year, 20-year, 50-year life of patience, if you're in healthcare, life of patent, if you're in engineering, it should be on an air gappable tape, right? So there's no reason why in 2023 that your entire data protection lifecycle should not be immutable from one tier to the next to the next. Jonah, this is going to get us not just to 321, this is going to get us to 32110 and be prepared.
Right. Well, and I like that you brought up compromised credentials and immutability / cloud under the same kind of umbrella, because something I'm beginning to see increasingly as Veeam supports more immutability, more object storage, is this almost very common and systemic misnomer of, oh, I just have object storage on-prem, or oh, I have an immutable storage right on-prem, we're safe. But that's really, it's not that simple. I mean, kind of touching back a little bit on earlier, I saw there was some presentation I went to with some Veeam sales engineers, and they presented some numbers, and it was a little more focused on kind of the M365 and SaaS side, but still very relevant to on-prem, where they said something along the lines of the majority by far of compromises came from social engineering attacks. So email phishing, things along those lines. And something I've seen is, just because you have on-prem immutability does not mean you're infallible. I mean, let's say Johnny in IT, when he set up the infrastructure, decided, hey, I'm going to create myself an admin account, and let's say I build Ceph. I add or hardened Linux repository, I'm going to go ahead and create an admin account. And while I'm setting it up, I'm going to temporarily save it to a notepad file on a server instead of putting it straight into a password vault. Or I do put it into a password vault, but maybe that vault gets compromised. Well, okay, now the bad actors coming in, they're checking files, they're checking vaults. Oh, hey, here's my root user or my sudo user on that repository. Why don't I go into sudo and delete the backups or wipe the entire server? Our weakest element is always the human element. And just because you have object storage or immutability on premises does not mean you're infallible. So yeah, I agree. It should be 300%. You should have on-prem immutability, off-prem immutability, and ideally tape as well for a long-term archival, whether it be a service you provide or a service provided by someone else. Because the more you can have, the more likely you are to be able to recover. The harder it's going to be for that malicious actor to get everything.
Agreed.
It really does kind of grind my gears. I've been in some sales calls where I've had people ask me, well, okay, why do I need a cloud provider? I have on-prem object, or kind of like you said, I'm glad you see a significant overlap. I'd say it's about 50-50. Well, why do I need you as a service provider when I have S3 compatible storage in the public cloud? When really they fail to see that they should have multiple redundancies in that. And it's not just one, but really the solution is all of them. Yeah, so ensuring clean restores. Boy, I get to beat this horse a little more dead, don't I? Seems like this comes up almost every webinar for me. So safeguarding your data, making sure you can do clean restores. There's multiple ways in which to do it. Of course, you want to ensure quick recovery. Veeam is very good for that, both on-prem and off-site. Veeam's encryption is great because it's secure, both in transit and at rest when you're sending to a cloud provider. 9% could not verify before restoring. Oh boy.
So one of the questions that was asked in the survey was, how do you ensure that you're not reinfecting the environment along the way? And so if you look in the lower left-hand corner, there's a 44% said they actually restore into a sandbox, which is, in my opinion, the only right answer. Right. So the idea of now in Veeam parlance, we call that a staged restore, but you can call it whatever you want. The point is that instead of simply restoring from the back repository directly back onto production accessible resources, you restore into some kind of a sandbox, isolated test area, whatever you want to call it, and verify, hopefully using a different malware detection technology than the one that was running in production, because otherwise, you're just checking the same way. If it missed it the first time, you're probably going to miss it the second time. Anyway, somehow along the way, you're going to test and to appease yourself. You decide that that data is a clean version of that data, and then if it is, then it goes ahead and restores back into that production environment. But if 44% are using some kind of a staged restore, a sandbox, a clean, isolated area, that means the inverse of 44, 56%, more than half, albeit slightly, of organizations are not doing that isolation, which means 56% actually do risk reinfecting the environment as part of the restoration. Now, to be fair, isolation is not easy, right? Dual stage restore is not easy, right? It's one of the reasons why Veeam is in the market share leader that we are. It's not an easy trick, but to not do that Oh, by the way, when you're down, all of your C levels are standing behind your shoulder. They're asking, when are you going to be up? When are you going to be up? When are you going to be up? And if you were to actually tell them, well, I've restored the data back on the production server, but I need to go and test it before I let the users back in, one of your CIOs or COOs is just going to flip a lid and say, no, light it up. We can't afford to be down anymore. Right. And so there is a lot of pressure to get back up running again. And yet 56% are going to run the risk of reinfection. And that's what you're seeing on the rest of that list is 35% try to restore to production and then test it really fast, which is really, really bad. And 12% are going to restore and then they're going to monitor and see if it happens again. Punchline. If it happened once and you don't know why, it's going to happen again. Right. And then lastly, there is 9% that just said, we don't know, but we got to get up and running again. We're going to restore and hope for the best. And with no disrespect intended, you kind of almost deserve to be reinfected at that point. So anyway, but maybe we'll take that out of the recording and post.
I do very much think that right there is your number one representative of the fact that you're not surveying just Veeam customers or even necessarily Veeam customers at all. And, you know, I'll kind of fall into your logic for a second too. If these are Veeam customers and they're not that bottom option, kind of shame on them. You know, they either don't have the Clark Kent or they feel they don't have the time. There are so many ways in which Veeam lets you easily sandbox and scan your machines for malware and test them hands-on to make sure maybe your antivirus missed it in your scans while restoring, but maybe there's a time bomb that'll re-encrypt when it launches, you know. So few people are using those though. Virtual Labs, Sure Backup, Sure Replica, Veeam Recovery Orchestrator, an offsite cloud provider. You know, there's 1,000 ways around that mountain, but it seems like so few customers actually utilize them. They just kind of get the backups or replication and they go, okay, we're done.
Yeah. Now talk about it from a DRaaS perspective though. So what does CyberFortress bring to that party?
So what CyberFortress brings is that isolated sandbox. When you spin up in our environment with those machines, they're in a sandbox. You can scan them, you can test them, you can make sure they're not going to re-encrypt. Equally so, you could take the time and you could troll through both your compromised environment and ours and maybe find that point of penetration. You know, maybe it wasn't a social engineering attack, or if it was, maybe you can find which account was compromised and make sure you change the password on that account before you let users back in. Or maybe, you know, maybe you had a compromised software, you know, maybe you had a bad version of SolarWinds or whatever software of the week has been compromised. And maybe you can go ahead and shut that system down or patch it before you bring everyone back live and give it internet access again to ensure you don't get re-encrypted, right? I mean, that's the goal. Get back up, don't lose your data again, because every time you have to restore is extra downtime.
Two key elements that come out of the next data point, one of which we've actually already broached on, but I think it's worth revisiting just with a little bit of your trajectory on it. The data point on the left, we actually already covered. How do you ensure offline air gap immutable kind of repositories? This was actually our immutability data, but I think there's something that's also nuanced on this, and that is where the momentum shift from the market is going. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, hyperscale usage year over year between 2022 and 23 is flat. The object storage with immutability, relatively flat. The normal storage array with immutability or locking, relatively flat. Tape went down just a few points, but I think the one thing that's really interesting on that left-hand side is a significant shift in the consumption of BAS. Now, for whatever reason, the statistics numbers aren't on this slide, so I apologize for that. But if memory serves, it goes from roughly 30 some odd % that were using BAS and DRaaS in 2021 to nearly 50% of organizations, actually just slightly where it's like 52, I think, that were using it in 2022. So there's a 1-year shift of nearly a 50% hop from 37 to 53 in BAS and DRaaS. And so I like the fact that while mediums that are self-managed stayed relatively flat on the consumption curve, so many organizations said, actually, we're going to be adding BAS and DRaaS in a 1-year window to the portfolio. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact of embracing that need for expertise, because it's the only option on this list which is not self-managed. That said, there's another nuance in cloud adoption, which I think is really important. And in fact, Jonah, you started to mention this already, in that one of the value props of CyberFortress is that you can use your infrastructure as part of that stage restore and as part of that rapid spin up using that secondary infrastructure. And the data bears that out. When organizations were asked, where are you going to recover to after ransomware? And I would argue, by the way, not just ransomware, we're seeing that same kind of shift for fire and flood and hurricane or tornado. The only thing that's different is that for fire and flood, you do not get the option of existing servers, that little gray option down the bottom. Because if you had a fire, the existing servers are crispy, right? If you had a flood, the existing servers are drippy. If you had a tornado, the existing servers are no longer on the premises, right? But other than that, the other options still hold true, and they are persistent across most of these disasters. But I like the fact the two most common scenarios of where organizations expect to fail over to during a crisis in 2023 are cloudy, right? You see hyperscale on the top of the list. Again, I don't know why the data didn't show up on this one slide, but hyperscale is a little over 60%, I think. And then in the DRAS was in the mid 40s. And then you'll see the 3 on-prem options on the bottom. I kind of do like the fact that the least presumed option is I'm going to go buy new servers. Because if you've ever dealt with supply chain in a post-COVID world, you know that deciding to get new servers is not like you ring up your favorite distributor and then the next day they show up on the loading dock. That is not how supply chain is working these days. But other than that,
even a pre-COVID world, I remember back when crypto had their huge surge, but this time it was hard drive mining. And at my previous provider, it was like 6 to 8 weeks in most cases to get hard drives to build out new servers. In a good period, I heard of some companies that were 6 to 12 months out on hardware because, and again, this was pre-COVID too. It was just everyone was buying up servers. Everyone was buying up hard drives to do mining on whatever currency was big back then.
So hopefully folks do download the report. I think we do have a QR code at some point to allow them to download the rest of the report because there's a lot more data that's in that. But what you'll find on the back cover of the report is there were kind of 3 lessons learned from those 1,200 victims, from those nearly 3,000 attacks. The one was the importance and the growing preponderance for usage of immutability and air gap technologies. We talked also about hybrid IT as where you're going to recover to, right? So using not just on-prem. I'm a fan of on-prem. I like, East Coast protecting West Coast and vice versa for some kinds of workloads, especially if you're in an all VMware environment. But there's a lot of power and expertise that comes from also leveraging cloud as part of your strategy. And then certainly be sure not to reinfect the environment along the way. Jonah, I'm going to let you kind of finish it off. I see that we've got a quote here from CyberFortress, and then there's some action items on our last slide.
Yeah, I think the quotes were from one of our technology partners, and don't ask me who, because even if I could share it, I don't know who. But it does align very nicely with what I've heard about both our BAS and DRAS offerings. The combination of CyberFortress and Veeam was 75% faster to restore, and it took just 5 clicks to complete versus 30 minutes of a high-skilled text time. Sounds like they're talking DRAS just based on the couple of clicks there. CyberFortress is now backing up all our on-prem servers, having the peace of mind that backups are occurring behind the scenes, that we can recover quickly in the event of a disaster, and that CyberFortress and Veeam are standing behind us every step of the way is a huge comfort. I think that sums it up pretty well when you're talking about the shift to BAS and DRAS providers and that expertise. 5 clicks versus 30 minutes of that company's highly skilled text time. So if you're wanting to download the guide, which I do recommend you do, actually, I think this is a QR code for a business impact analysis worksheet. So this is some of that documentation I talked about that's helping you determine maybe your RTPOs, build out that proper run book, get things documented. But I'm sure as well in the recording and some of the social media after, we'll probably have links to that data protection trends report, which I do. And everyone got a copy in their email if you registered. So if you're here listening to it live, you should check your email. I do very much recommend that you read the guide, though. It's, what is it, Jason? 20, 30 pages, I think, usually.
Actually, we went a little shorter this year, so I think it's like 18. Okay. So, and most of it's pretty
very
charts.
Worth the read. Yeah, very worth the read. Very very good charts beyond even just what we've covered in here. A lot of little caveats we didn't necessarily have time to cover. And I always take the time to read it every year. In fact, after this, I probably will be reading it. I would have read it sooner, but Jason said he's headed to the woods tomorrow. I got back from a week in the woods on Saturday, and I've been playing catch up from vacation. So I haven't quite had a chance to read it myself, but it will be happening.
If you have questions about the research itself, you can email strategicresearch@veeam.com, and I'm happy to take your questions there. Also, if there were any problems with with getting to the report, the other thing that we often will do is there is a short URL for that. So if you can go to VEE.am/RW23, that's VEE.am/RW23, ransomware 23.
And if you don't remember that or don't want to write it down, it should be in the bottom right of most of the slides when you watch the recording.
Very good. All right. Well, I'm going to go pack for the woods. I'm gone for 10 days. So, Jonah, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you. And for all the folks that are out there, let me just share the same model that Jonah and I share with the scouts, and that is be prepared for your next crisis or disaster.
Well, I think the story goes is, what is it? Someone asked our founder, be prepared for what? And I think his response was, well, just about anything.
It's a good way to finish. Y'all have a good day.